дитинко моя, дитинко, де ти від нас відлітаєш, на кого мене лишаєш? Йой-йой, дитинко
So the piece is really about migration and loss and memory, because it's my memory of her telling the story and her recollection, you know, sort of twice removed, and also cultural transformation, leaving Ukraine through Europe to the Middle East to the U.S. So all wrapped up into one. And you know, whenever I think of the story, I have my image of it, you know, of the forest, of the border, of the person pulling the shade when it was okay to cross, and the shade, you know, all that, and even the town itself. But it's probably nothing like what it actually was, you know. I did a master class with some young composers, and they, I happened to play a couple of pieces that were tributes to close friends that passed away, you know. And they said, "Is it harder to write a piece like that?" And I said, "Well, the piece I'm writing right now is the hardest piece. Whatever piece you're working on is the hardest piece you've had to write." And it's true. You know, this has been a really tough piece for me to write, and for a number of reasons. You know, reconnecting with my family history, and you know, that alone is difficult for me. And it's also about working with David Krakauer, who's an old friend. You know, we went to Music and Art High School in New York together. So there are several strands to the sort of personal connection with this piece. You know, David and I, we were 14, 15 years old, playing in bands together in New York City in the late 60s, early 70s, let's say. You know, we went to Music and Art High School together. We were both wind players. I was saxophone, he was clarinet. He also played saxophone at the time.
This was the hill we walked up from St. Nicholas Avenue up to Convent Avenue. And we were together in a music and art jazz band. So there's a photo.
Great shot.
Tambourine
I hope
man.
you got paid for doubling on that,
Totally.
that afternoon.
But that was a whole other hairstyle, yeah. And then this was also from that time with a drummer, Tony Moreno. Oh, there's the Norman McWilliams, trombone player. Mm-hmm. Oh, and this was Justin DiCiocio, who took over the band. But this was our director at the time, Bernard Gluckman.
Indeed.
Yeah, indeed. Edith Del Val, and all these were all the music teachers. Anyhow. So that's the 1974 M&A yearbook. Great. Yeah.
You know, it was New York in the early 70s, so it was the downtown jazz loft scene. You know, we played together in different gigs throughout New York, and our mutual friend, Anthony Coleman, who was pianist, composer as well, you know, led these groups that we played in, and we had great gigs together. You know, we played at the WBAI free music store. I don't know how Anthony got these gigs. We were talking about this recently, but he managed to. And so, you know, we sort of came of age as improvisers, as kind of creative, you know, young people. We were the jazz clique in the high school, you know. During gym, we would go into a corner and just talk about Thelonious Monk and whatever.
And at that particular time in the early 70s, when you could go out and hear some of the greatest masters of, let's say, the core nugget of traditional jazz, when jazz was evolving and everybody from like the drummer with Count Basie, Papa Joe Jones, to the Art Ensemble of Chicago, to Cecil Taylor, to Ornette Coleman and Don Cherry down in the Prince Street loft, you know, when they were really breaking ground. I heard a big band at the Village Vanguard led by Cy Oliver that also had the legendary tenor player Bud Johnson, you know, people like that. And I heard the Duke Ellington Band.
In Pittsburgh, in fact, we met and I played him some of my music. We had lunch together and we said, you know, we need to cook up a project. And I mentioned a piece that was a dedication to my grandmother. And I was thinking about the superstitious aspect of my grandmother. It was kind of Eastern European, this idea of evil eye and turning over glasses to, you know, catch the evil spirits. This was part of her personality. I was telling about that and thinking about the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique, the last movement, which is the English translation of the title is Which is Sabbath, which is Sabbath. And how it's this kind of cauldron of craziness and sort of alludes to you know, this kind of superstitious or you know, trance-like state. And I was talking about, you know, appropriating just elements from the Berlioz into this piece with sort of klezmer excursions possibly, or quasi-klezmer excursions, because there's also a folk clarinet tune that emerges in that last movement. And also my microtonal language and sort of somehow blending this, appropriating aspects of the Berlioz, but it's really a new piece, you know. And he was interested in that idea. But then I told him this story. You know, he wanted to know more about my grandmother. The story goes that when I was, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 or 7, at a Passover Seder in my grandmother's house in the Bronx in New York, where we had 30 people crammed into a small apartment with a table that ran the length of the apartment. You know, as a kid, I heard the story of it was referred to as the Grainitz, the story of the Grainitz, which means border. The crossing of the border, the escape from Ukraine. So they came from a small town in Ukraine, Proskurov, Ukraine. And my mother would tell us the story. All my cousins heard the stories from their parents about how the pogroms came through the town and massacred 2,500 people. But the way this story was told was that the priest of the town, in exchange for their furniture, arranged for a hay cart to take them out of town. My grandmother tied the silverware around her legs, and they all, you know, ran out and went into the hay cart and traveled to the border, where they waited for the sign that it was okay to cross. They crossed the border, and there's also 2 ways the story goes. One is that they went to Italy, but the way I heard the story is that they went to Vienna, and they sold the silverware in Vienna for tickets to Palestine. And they lived in Palestine for 6 years. And that my mother was born en route to the border. She was born in the woods or something like that. So, you know, my grandmother's an incredibly strong woman, you know, to endure that, and my grandfather as well. Once they got to Palestine, my grandfather took his 2 oldest sons and went to New York and set up, they're all carpenters. And my grandfather was a woodworker. He built furniture. He was an artist, really. But they made enough money after 4 years of working in carpentry in New York. They sent the money back to my grandmother, who was back in Palestine with the rest of the kids. They had enough money to bring everybody over, so they all came over.
Jankerle Schnitzer gewesen im Tortenseher Gitterfrei. Jankerle Schnitzer wegen machen. Jankerle Schnitzer zu den Furnitures. Hat uns gemacht Karniesen, so wie Bach hängt so einer. Und nur hat uns gemacht ein Verein, weil man mal Gott hat Picture, die ganze Semene. Für meine Familie, so das heißt das Picture. Und sehr gewesen ein feiner German.
You know, we heard the story in many different forms and in different situations, but the most powerful relating of the story was at this Passover Seder, where my grandmother gathered the grandchildren after the Passover Seder was completed and told us the story of the Grenitz once again, but in a style that I didn't realize till much later was a traditional Eastern European lament style, which was part sobbing, part storytelling, part chanting, part crying. You know, it was just very powerful. When your grandmother cries in front of you, it's something you remember. You know, it's an emotional connection to a memory. I mean, it's sort of deeply implanted in my brain. And I told that story to David at our lunch meeting in Pittsburgh after we were thinking, well, you know, the Berlioz is a good idea. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, that's the piece. He said, that's the piece.
So then I thought, you know, that the Ukrainian lament, the voice, the sampled voice is really amazingly beautiful. And to me, the way it struck me was that perhaps in light of some kind of horrible massacre, this would have been the voice of the conscience of the other.
You know, the Berlioz does show that superstitious side of your grandmother, but it should be preceded by a lament. So the piece would have two parts. It would be lament / witch's Sabbath. And it was just like, that was the first incredible input that David gave me for the piece. Anthony Davis, the composer, improviser, creative of the opera Malcolm X and many other wonderful pieces, once said that for him, composition was improvisation with reflection. And I think that sort of sums it up for me as well, at least at the beginning stages. In the old days, I would have a tape, like a cassette recorder or something, and record things, just to get the basic material that comes out of an improvisatory moment. You know, that kind of creative activity is important to me. Then I take a step back and things develop in my head. It's moving things around, it's refining it, but it usually starts from some sort of improvisatory moment on a keyboard or just, you know, in some way. Another part of the piece is really sort of relating to just the sound of the voice in a way. So I didn't realize that what I was hearing when I was a kid from my grandmother was a traditional Eastern European lament until I heard a lecture by an ethnomusicologist named Margarita Mazzo about Russian laments, and she played some examples. And this was in the mid-90s. And as soon as I heard one of those audio clips, it took me right back to that moment. And it just brought back that whole experience of my grandmother telling the story to us in that style. And I realized what it was. And I just kind of filed that information. So when this piece was starting to develop, I said, well, you know, I need to find field recordings of actual Jewish Ukrainian laments. And I spoke to pretty much every expert that exists. I mean, really. The consensus was that they don't exist, that there aren't really recordings of, specifically of Jewish Ukrainian laments. There probably were, but that they've been lost. But there are Ukrainian laments, and there are Jewish laments. And so when I played both of those laments at the same time, the Ukrainian and the Jewish, it was what I remember hearing. My brain kind of put it together and sort of synthesized it. And the other aspect of it, I actually have my grandmother's voice. So my Aunt Nettie, who's the youngest of the four sisters, had the good idea to record my grandmother when she was living with her in her last years of her life. And she has about 15 minutes worth of audio, including her telling a bit of that story, of the Granitz story. She talks about a man from the town named Yankala Schnitzel, who was also a woodworker, who was a friend of my grandfather's, who gave them a picture frame as a gift. And it was a beautiful picture frame. And she says, you know, it was some frame, she says. It's all in Yiddish and Ukrainian, but she says the English word. It was some frame. It was a beautiful frame, but they had to leave it behind when they left. So it's a piece of their lives that they had to leave behind, a very cherished object, gift. It's beautiful the way she tells the story, just the contour of her voice. And so I use that, and it's kind of iconic of, you know, what was left behind, you know. And there's also a Russian folk song that she sings on the tape. She does a lot of singing on this tape. So I use my grandmother's singing voice towards the middle of the piece, and David Krakauer duets with her. So he's duetting with my grandmother, and I think that's pretty wild. Just, you know, it's just incredible to me.
Na ostra gubila gojaniya, na perim krasnom berigu, Tam была воспоминаний, две сестрицы молодые. Они прекрасно купались, не знали смерти при собой. Солнце скрылось за тучи, они потонули вдвоем. Как родители знали, что их дети уже нет, они к морю прибежали, дети уже нет. Ах вы, дети, что вы тоскали помогли, вы с родными не прощались, и вас на свете создали.
Some things never change, right? When you're an artist, a creative person, certain things you keep revisiting over and over and trying to get it right. So in this piece, we have Ukrainian and Yiddish, and there's different streams of language. It's a raw expression. There's like a lot of vocal fry, and cracking of the voice. But there's also a contour, a pitch contour. In this case, it's based on a quarter tone flat D, the Ukrainian lament. So it fits into my microtonal language as well. I happen to have that pitch in this pitch world that I've developed. The lament starts on a flat D, quarter tone flat D, and then gradually moves up because there's no accompaniment. So when you're doing something a cappella, sometimes there's some pitch wavering over time. So it's kind of cool the way this starts flat and then moves up to the normal D, and then starts, shifting up a little bit more through the piece. So that's integrated into the piece itself.
There was this one spot where, in the cadenza...
Well, this is a question mark I had about...
Oh, yeah, that stuff sounded so amazing on the MIDI.
Oh, but it doesn't work on it.
It sounded like a telephone ringing. I was like, how the hell am I going to do that?
So I'm thinking of overtones, like either trills with overtones, overblowing in some way, or tremolos with then bringing in upper partials.
I mean, that's a pretty good one. Just For me, it's very helpful to have the MIDI file, so I can actually listen to the whole piece, as opposed to just the clarinet part, to try to see what the bigger picture is. And then I like to do what we just did today, getting together with the composer and going through spots to see what seems playable, what maybe needs to be massaged a little bit. And then I'll delve in and work really hard on it and, learn the piece. Like I would learn a Weber concerto or a Mozart concerto.
That's really close to it.
Throughout the ages, like Mozart heard, Stadler, and he wrote the Mozart clarinet concerto, and probably wouldn't have necessarily written that much incredible clarinet music if he hadn't heard a player who could do so many amazing things and who was a very expressive musician. And Brahms heard Richard Mühlfeld. And actually, that was even more profound because Brahms had retired from writing music. He had written to his publisher, "I'm old, I'm done," And then he heard this guy play the clarinet, and he freaked out and just wrote 4 of the most amazing masterpieces. I dig that one.
Yeah, me too.
So there are those models from the 18th and 19th centuries. And then, of course, now in the 20th century, many composers have heard people and written specific pieces for them and inspired by their way of playing, but also their personality and what they bring to the table. Yeah, the more microtonal, the better.
Yes.
I'm going to microtonal the
yeah.
living bejesus out of this thing.
I just realized that a whole new section needs to be written towards the end. And after meeting with David last week, he had some great ideas about actually continuing the piece in a certain way. And he was right. So I have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. And it may involve some improvisation. What's so lovely about David is, his improvisational sensibilities and skills are so amazing. That's sort of the daunting aspect of this, because how can I write for such a great improviser, like a solo clarinet part? So there's his improvisations, and I was giving him a lot of room in this piece. And he actually threw it back in my court and said, well, I would really like more guidance here, and I want you to actually be more specific here and give him more of a framework, for instance, in this cadenza section where I gave him the beginning, but then I wanted him to just sort of blow, But he said, well, I want you to dig in a little bit more here. And he's right. Wants me to be the composer. I'll put my tie on and I'll be the composer. think it's always helpful, like at a first rehearsal or something, to get up in front of the group for the composer to talk to the musicians and talk a little bit about what the piece is about. And I think that goes a long way beyond just the notes and rhythms and some directions that you might include in the score, just to provide the context, the basic inspiration for it at least, and then maybe they can tap into that on some level.
Need somewhere to go, so let's just have a very soft kind of entrance there, and then gradually gets louder. It gets louder.
Right there, 3 before the 5/8. 3 before the 5/8. 1, 2. One more time, the same spot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Find them to work and find them to vote!
Post the election in November 2016, I know a lot of artists, friends, have been thinking about, well, how can I even go ahead and create anything? They were just feeling so depressed and powerless and just hard to create and get sort of the positive creative energy going. With this piece, the theme has always been the same, but it's sort of taken on added significance, I think is maybe the best way to put it. I always hoped that this piece would resonate in terms of creating empathy for the other or for a refugee situation.
It's very sobering. The election was very, very sobering as we face a very real crisis of fascism taking over our country. Here I am going on record. Here we are all going on record. And we all have to have the bravery to go on record and say these things and keep fighting and preserve our way of life to the best of our ability. So I think, in this way, here's this piece of music. Here are our careers as composers. We represent arts, aesthetics, thinking, tolerance. That's already very, very important. But after the election, it is now our responsibility to take these stances. We can't take it for granted anymore. And the forces that drove our grandparents and our great-grandparents out of Eastern Europe, forces of terror, forces of totalitarianism, we can't let that happen here.
Knocking on doors, marching in order to change minds. But I think there's a place for storytelling. And I think music, although this piece is not strictly narrative in that way, but through the sound of the voice of the laments, the field recordings, and through the clarinet and through the orchestra and through the sounds and emotions that this piece might represent, there's a chance that it would hopefully create some sort of empathy. So I think, this idea of our country not welcoming refugees, or at least putting a hold on situations that are dire, family situations. I think of my own family, and I wouldn't be here today if our country didn't welcome my grandmother and her kids. And they were in a similar situation as many are today in Syria and elsewhere. So it just seems like, our story is their story. And I think that's sort of the key point, creating that sort of connection and the sort of empathetic feeling, or creating empathy for the situation of others. Yeah. Of course, in the end, the piece might mean nothing. It's like, I mean, if it's not good music, if it doesn't get to you, in a sort of a gut level, and I think that might be part of the problem with political pieces, that, and I think this is what I was mentioning earlier, that the message is sort of hammered in such a strong way, and that the artistic side of it doesn't give you room, it doesn't give you enough intellectual and emotional room to respond, where it's just, it's too overt, it's too literal in some ways, and so it's a hard balance, and the piece has to be good. So that's the hardest thing about it. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, the piece has to be good, but it has to ring true. So you can't plan that. I mean, it just sort of has everything has to line up. Yeah. Well, the intentions have to be clear so that at least the performers have something to respond to, and so they can put their all into it.
I think we'll do it, and if it does, either way, we'll move it tomorrow. But it'll take 5 to 7 minutes to move it now. Well, if he's going to move, so we should do the sound check. I can use a little more in this, but not much. That's plenty. Did you check the house? We did that earlier. Okay, all right. Well, yeah, if we need more, we'll just...
So we had our Beyond Microtonal Music Festival that I organized in Pittsburgh. The opening concert was an orchestral concert, all microtonal music, and it included the premiere of my piece. And the idea I had was to take advantage of the fact that in Pittsburgh we have an enormous amount of grassroots new music ensembles that started up in the last 3 to 5 years mostly. So I thought of this as an opportunity to bring these musicians that are dedicated to new music together, under the theme of microtonal music, so they could learn about microtonal music. It's just, many of these people are my friends, so the idea of having people that are close to me, or that I already have some sort of musical relationship with, play the premiere of my piece was an amazing thing. The best thing about writing music is working with people and getting the feedback and having that experience. So this was an opportunity to do that as well.
Are you hearing the Omglocken enough out there? Yeah, I think you could hit the Omglocken more. Yeah, I'm seeing it and sort of hearing it in the big passages, in the solos too.
Yeah, this is 168, more cowbell. Bring it out.
More cowbell, please. Yeah, all of them. Yeah, more cowbell, all of them. Yeah.
everybody. Welcome to the Carnegie Music Hall, the opulent Carnegie Music Hall. My name is Ben Harrison. I'm the Curator of Performing Arts at the Andy Warhol Museum. And I just want to take a minute to say that we are really thrilled to start this evening our 9th year in partnership with the Music on the Edge program at the University of Pittsburgh, Department of Music. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Mathew Rosenblum for Music on the Edge. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, welcome. Welcome to the first event of the Beyond Microtonal Music Festival. This is our second festival. The first was in 2015, and it takes a village to put on something of this scope, a 3-day festival. And we have an orchestra on stage that is devoted to performing new music. We've been rehearsing in a performance space that had no heat, as we were at 0 degrees outside. So we were wearing coats and scarves and hats, and nobody left. They stayed for every single rehearsal. And that alone was just amazing. But I just want to point out that these grassroots ensemble in Pittsburgh, which form the core of our orchestra, include members from Alia Musica, Nat 28, Cameratone, Elko, Wolf Trap, and there are many others, Trillium, Cassia Ensemble, C Compiler, Ion Sound. These are young new music groups in Pittsburgh that are sort of setting the tone for other cities and making Pittsburgh a hub for new music. And it's like a renaissance for new music in this town. So I'm not finished, just a little bit more. So who do we get to conduct an orchestra devoted to new music? I mean, specifically new music. Well, none other than Gil Rose, native Pittsburgher, who's the founder and artistic director and conductor of the Boston Modern Orchestra Project. For close to 23 years, he's been performing exclusively contemporary music, orchestral contemporary music, and also with their own record label with over 60 recordings. So bringing Gil back to Pittsburgh is a very special aspect of this as well. So the piece starts with a lament.
Дитинко моя, дитинко, де ти від нас відлітаєш, на кого мене лишаєш? Йой-йой, дитинко моя, дитинко, де ти від нас відлітаєш, на кого мене лишаєш? Йой-йой, дитинко моя, дитинко, де ти від нас відлітаєш, на кого мене лишаєш? Йой-йой, пташко моя золотика, м'яку далеку доріжку. Йой-йой, ластівочко моя, Томся з тобою мало наговорила, Томся мало натішила. Йой-йой, дитинице, моя дитинице, що ти мені наробила? Ой, Боже мій, Боже, що я буду
And that goes on for about 6 minutes. During that opening section, there are little bits of the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique that come in, just little moments, it sort of peeks out now and then. But after the lament section of the piece, the opening section, we move into a series of episodes. So it's very episodic with the clarinet sort of virtuosic lines that move quickly through various terrains that sometimes reference the Berlioz, and sometimes you hear the lament also filtered in. So it's kind of a mashup of both the lament and the material from the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. The next big section of the piece, it's really a second movement. In the middle of the piece is built on a Russian folk song that is based on my grandmother's singing of a recording of her singing this Russian folk song. And it starts out with the strings accompanying my grandmother's voice, and then the clarinet enters, and the clarinet then improvises over the Russian folk song.
На острогу была гуляния, на первом красном берегу, там было воспоминание, две сестрицы молодые. Они прекрасно купались, не знали света при собой. Солнце вскрылось за тучи, они потонули вдвоем. Как родители знали, что не ходят живет, они снова побежали, дети, живет. Ах, были дети, что и тоской помогли, вы с родными прощались, и вас на свете создали.
So after David finishes his improvisation, there's a sort of a closing string section, which is the same way that the folk song opened, with an introductory string, very lyrical section. And then at the close of that middle section with the folk song, David has his cadenza. It's an extended improvisation built on very strictly notated music that I wrote for him, but he improvises and expands on it quite a bit. And so the classical era, and I'm not a musicologist, but in the classical era, there's always a cadenza built into the piece, into a concerto, and it features the soloist by themselves. And it's often improvised. Different performers will write their own cadenza. So this is very traditional in that sense. I mean, but once again, this is a piece for David Krakauer. So it's a very special kind of cadenza that you're going to get. At the end of the cadenza, the orchestra takes over with an orchestral interlude that is once again a mashup of my grandmother's singing the Russian folk song, but with the sort of violent articulations and rhythmic accents from the Berlioz. So then the orchestral interlude ends with this similar lyrical string writing that the second movement began with. And then the piece begins with yet another quote from the Berlioz, but a very sort of murmuring, rippling kind of texture that the strings introduce, and the clarinet joins. But it opens very, very slowly and very sort of in a contemplative way, but gradually builds. The percussion enter with this rhythmic figure that sort of stays there. The orchestra builds, and then we're back into the Lament. It comes in for the last minute or so of the piece, and David is wailing over that, and it's this sort of a relentless build-up at the end.
What have
Oh boy.
we being together?
Yeah, sure.
Hanging out.
Pretty easy trip home.
If they just but if they
112 kind of pencil in there, but
that's very fast. And where does that line end?
it ends right before you enter with that. So the 112 is good. And then we're good. Then we're home.
I think that with a piece such as Matthew's, which changes tempos and changes moods and goes through all these different episodes and has all these different kinds of, rhythmic feels, doing it bit by bit makes a lot of sense. Recording the piece in chunks, because then you can really focus on one thing, and get it right. And with the miracles of editing today and Pro Tools, you can really, I think it's an efficient way to record it. I mean, if we had gone on a, 10 concert tour together, and this was the end of the tour, I would say maybe do it differently. Like, let's just run it, get a run and get the flow and continuity in that way. But given that there was a 3-hour rehearsal and then a recording, and that's it, and of course Gil's prior performance, which gave him the experience of doing it one time before, but still, it's a very short time to put something together. So I think doing it this way is going to yield the most efficient result.
So we have time. I'll bop them over.
So are we miking the synth speaker?
Yes.
So we're adding that.
Yes.
So we don't have a free channel.
Right, you are.
Okay.
Wait a minute. Isn't there some? What about channel 7 on the whatever goes to channel 7 on the Grace? Isn't it?
You gotta get out of here, Ted. I'm gonna make famous and interesting comments.
Okay, I'm getting out of here.
So Matthew and I have been talking about this piece for a long time. I kind of knew about it in its germination stage. I knew the ideas. I knew he wanted to base it on this tape of his grandmother along with the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique. So I knew kind of what was coming, and then Matthew actually delivered me the score in pieces in a way, and then there was next to final version, almost final version, and then final version, and then the one that was after the final version. Having done a lot of Matthew's music, then I kind of have techniques for dealing things that are unique to Matthew's sound world. Matthew's use of microtonal music is something that a lot of players aren't familiar or comfortable with. They're familiar with it, but they're not comfortable with it, especially at the level of intricacy that Matthew uses it. But my players have done a lot of Matthew's music. Actually, we've made a whole CD of Matthew's music, and I think Matthew's also gotten better at writing microtonal music so that a standard symphony orchestra can play it quickly and readily. I mean, he finds ways to help them get the technical and auditory information they need to make the microtones happen. So he's gotten better at it. People are better at it in general. It's become more a piece of the picture than it used to be.
Working with BMOP is amazing. I mean, they're obviously an incredibly well-oiled machine. They play together all the time. They, have new music scores put in front of them constantly. So they really are so incredibly experienced at, fielding whatever challenge is before them. And you can really feel their connection with Gil, too. It just works so smoothly. So yesterday's rehearsal was a real pleasure, and I think today's recording is going to just be amazing.
Well, this orchestra was founded about 23 years ago. Everybody told me you couldn't establish a full symphony orchestra that just did 20th century and 21st century music. But we've been at it for a while. We've done a lot of commissions, a lot of recordings. We have our own record label. We're sort of a unique institution in America. We're really the biggest new music ensemble, just we're symphony orchestra size. So what we're doing today with Mathew is sort of our daily bread.
With any piece of music, you learn it more and more. I mean, even listening to an MP3 mock-up or listening to a recording, I think just playing a piece, you feel it more and more. I mean, and then as you hear more and you get more familiar, I think, I guess one gets more comfortable and looser. It was an interesting process for me because it was, I'm not improvising it. I'm playing his cadenza. I'm playing the notes he wrote. Well, the first thing I did was to really look at the notes and try to get the notes and the rhythms basically as Mathew notated them. But as I went along, I actually wrote Mathew a text or an email, and I said, do you mind if I just treat the rhythms a little bit like graphic notation so I can feel absolutely free? Because I just wanted to let it rip. And also just sort of feel like that my gestures would be very spontaneous. And he said, wow, that's great, terrific. This was a perfect provocation, just to do what I do, sort of like, Krakauer, do your thing, And then so it was like this, pushed me in that direction.
A recording session, you want to break things down into their simplest components, and then you can put them together later on in post-production. So unlike the Pittsburgh performance with all the tape going and the singing and the wailing, it'll seem very dry in a sense. So my big job tonight is to get the players to sort of feel the musical place they're at in the piece without a large component of the piece even being there for them to listen to.
Well, there's a lot to be said for taking a longer take in a recording session, and usually in sessions, with classical pieces or pieces of a long, length. It's good to, at some point record a large section of a work for the flow of it, and just sort of for consistency and also for emotional connections within the piece. It's like a linear flow that really is important.
Personally, I've never heard a clarinet make that.
For me, the story of the piece is so compelling. I just keep thinking about a young woman, pregnant, strapping the family silverware on her legs and running out the back door and giving birth in the woods. And we're in an incredibly painful time, I think, in the history of the entire world, and I think it's a big struggle that we're in now. And stories like these need to be told as metaphors for more compassion and more involvement of people, as we're all interconnected humans on this planet. And to go, oh, well, we're going to build a wall, or we're going to put a travel ban on these people and these people, with a blanket statement. It's so beyond inhumane now, the rhetoric that's out there. And I think that we as artists have the opportunity to provide a counter message, an alternative message. We've all been talking this weekend about sort of the subtext of this piece and the idea of the Ukrainian and Jewish laments living together at the beginning, and thinking about people living together on the same community, same territory, and coexisting. And then maybe the Berlioz Witches' Sabbath introduces the idea of superstition and fear and chaos and craziness, the craziness of the pogrom, going in and killing people. And just that chaos and that superstition that separates people, that drives them apart, that makes them hate each other, that makes them kill each other. And we look at this world today, and we're a hair's breadth away from it. Charlottesville. Someone goes and runs his car into somebody who's peaceably protesting. One small example. We need to wake up. The world needs to wake up, and I think I personally in my work have been doing stuff and putting forward that message, and I really applaud Mathew for writing this piece because I think that message is deeply in this piece. That message of coexistence and tolerance and humanistic values and fighting against fear and ignorance and hatred. So I think it's very important. Here we go.
Thank you.